Welcome to the Eclectic. Some cases do not resolve into answers. They accumulate detail instead, and in doing so, they leave behind something heavier than explanation. This is one of those cases. There are places that feel abandoned, and there are places that feel interrupted. Lake Shawnee Amusement Park in West Virginia belongs to the second category. The rides are gone now, or mostly gone, but the feeling remains. The land seems to remember too much. Older grief, newer tragedy, human noise, water, rust, silence. If you stand there long enough, the site stops feeling like a ruin and starts feeling like a sentence cut off in the middle. This is part of what makes Lake Shawnee so unsettling. It is not simply a forgotten amusement park. It is a place where several histories overlap so tightly that none of them can be separated cleanly from the others. The modern haunted reputation did not begin with a ghost story. It began with the land itself, and with the fact that long before anyone thought to build a place of leisure here, the ground already carried memory. Local history connects the site to native presence and to burial ground claims, and it also ties the land to an older episode of frontier violence involving the Clay family in the late 18th century. Those stories should be handled carefully. They are not props. They are not there to make the episode feel more exotic or more cursed. They are part of the site's real historical weight. And they matter because Lake Shawnee was never an empty canvas waiting politely for an amusement park to arrive. It was already a place with history, already a place with loss, already a place where the past could not be fully erased. And then, in the 20th century, someone put rides on it. Before the Ferris wheel, before the swing ride, before the laughter of summer crowds, there was land. That sounds simple, but at Lake Shawnee, it is the only simple thing. The area that would eventually become an amusement park had a history long before any developer saw it as a business opportunity. It was part of a broader landscape shaped by indigenous presence, settlement, conflict, and the long American habit of turning older places into newer ones, without fully accounting for what came before. That earlier layer is difficult to talk about responsibly, because it is often flattened in haunted location coverage. The danger is that indigenous history gets reduced to atmosphere, a vague burial ground claim, a suggestion of a curse, a background detail meant to intensify the mood. But the truth is more serious than that. When a site like this is described as haunted, the haunting often begins with displacement. People were here first. People lived here first. People were affected here first. The land was already meaningful before it became entertaining. That matters for more than ethical reasons. It matters because it changes the shape of the story. If you begin with the amusement park, Lake Shawnee becomes a quirky, abandoned attraction with a spooky reputation. If you begin earlier, the park becomes something more uncomfortable, a later attempt to overwrite an older place with a profitable one. That shift gives the site a different kind of darkness. Not theatrical darkness, but historical darkness. The frontier story attached to the land reinforces that feeling. One of the most repeated early accounts connected to Lake Shawnee is the Clay family tragedy of 1783. The details vary depending on which retelling you read, but the broad outline remains consistent enough to shape the legend. There was violence, there was loss. Children were caught in it. The land, in later retellings, becomes a witness to suffering that never really left. It is worth pausing there, because this is where Lake Shawnee stops being just a haunted site and starts becoming a layered historical palimpsest. Every time the story is retold, another generation adds something, a little more fear, a little more certainty, a little more spectacle. The result is a place that seems to resist any single clean explanation. The land had meaning before the park. It had memory before the park. It had pain before the park. Then the 20th century arrived with its own ambitions. By the 1920s, amusement parks were part of a wider cultural dream. They offered motion, noise, colour, and temporary escape from everyday life. They promised that for the price of admission, ordinary life could be left behind for an afternoon. In coal country, that promise carried even more force. Recreation was not just entertainment, it was relief. It was the fantasy of lightness in a region defined by labour, extraction, and hard physical work. When Lake Shawnee Amusement Park opened in 1926, it fit that national pattern in miniature. It was a local pleasure ground, not a giant destination park, but it had the essential ingredients: rides, water, family spaces, food, and the kind of atmosphere that made summer feel larger than it really was. The park's rise was not unusual. What made it unusual was where it rose. That is the thing that keeps pulling people back to this very story. Not just that the park existed, but that it was built on a site already carrying older histories that were never truly resolved. The amusement park did not create the unease on its own. It inherited it. Then it added its own layer. And that layer, well, that would prove harder to forget than anyone ever expected. By the time Lake Shawnee opened in 1926, the country was deep into a period that liked to imagine itself as modern, fast, and bright. Amusement parks fit that mood perfectly. They offered motion for the sake of motion, music for the sake of noise, and pleasure packaged as a public experience. A park like this did not need to be grand to work. It only needed to promise escape. Lake Shawnee did exactly that. The park sat near Princeton, West Virginia, and a region where coal shaped daily life and where a simple outing could mean more than it might elsewhere. For families living under the pressure of hard labour and limited leisure, the park offered something precious: a place to go, a thing to do, and a memory to make. Even a small park could feel like a major event if it gave people a different world for a few hours. So the grounds filled with the usual symbols of recreation: a Ferris wheel, swing rides, a dance hall, concessions, a lake for swimming and skating, cabins, a racetrack. The details vary slightly depending on the source, but the overall picture is clear enough. This was a local amusement park built around water, motion, and seasonal life. It matters because the park was not inherently sinister. It was not designed as a horror setting. It was designed to be familiar, cheerful, and profitable. The place would have been full of ordinary sounds: children shouting, parents talking over one another, the mechanical clank of ride parts shifting under weight, music drifting across the grounds, the splash of swimmers, the sound of shoes on dirt, the easy brightness of a summer afternoon before the heat begins to soften into the evening. If you are trying to understand why Lake Shawnee is so memorable now, that ordinary beginning, it's part of the answer. A place feels more unsettling when it was once meant to be joyful. A broken thing hurts more when you can still imagine it whole. The park's existence also depends on a kind of historical irony. The site had already carried older significance, but the amusement park era represented a different American impulse: to claim, to redesign, and commercialize the land for a new purpose. That does not mean the park's founders were consciously erasing history in some sort of villainous sense. It's most likely they were doing what business owners do. They saw land, they saw opportunity, and they saw a place where people could spend money on recreation. But history does not disappear just because someone changes the use of a site. It lingers. And at Lake Shawnee, that lingering quality became increasingly visible once the park's life began to thin. The 1920s gave the park its opening, but not its permanence. Like many small amusement parks, it depended on maintenance, local interest, and the shifting economics of leisure. When the park was active, it had energy. When it began to age, it became vulnerable. A ride that is charming when bright painted and functioning can become deeply unnerving when the paint chips, the metal bends, and the surrounding grass grows high enough to brush against its supports. That transition is crucial to the Lake Shawnee story because it transforms the park from a place of public movement into a place of visual stillness. It stops being something people use and starts being something people look at. The gaze changes, the meaning changes with it, and that shift opens the door for the next part of the legend. Because once the park was no longer a living business, the stories of death became easier to come to the foreground. The exact number, often repeated, is 6. 6 visitor deaths. 6 moments where the park's promise of fun became something else entirely. That number has become part of the site's mythos, repeated in tourism coverage and haunted location articles, often enough to take on a life of its own. But the important thing is not to present it as if every case is equally documented. The historical record is thinner than the legend. Some stories are repeated more confidently than they are verified, and some details have clearly been polished by retelling. Still, the emotional power of the claim comes from the shape of the stories. The most famous death is the girl on the swing ride. The repeated version says a truck backed into the swing area and struck her. In later retellings, she becomes the child who never left the ride. The presence people claim to feel when the wind moves through the structure, or when the scene seems to just a little too quiet. Whether every detail is documented exactly as repeated is less important than the fact that the story itself has become central to how the park is imagined. There is also the drowning story tied to the swimming pool. In some versions, a boy's arm became trapped in a drain pipe. In others, the circumstances shift slightly. That variation is a clue that the tale has passed through many hands, but the pattern remains. A child, water, danger, tragedy in a place meant for relaxation. Another drowning story is often attached to the lake or pond itself. A canoe tipping over, a child going under, a sudden loss of control in a setting that was supposed to be safe. Again, the details are not always stable. The atmosphere is, and in a haunted narrative, atmosphere often carries more weight than precision. These deaths matter to the story of Lake Shawnee because they create a brutal contrast between expectation and outcome. The park promised family fun. Instead, it became associated with accidents, loss, and the uneasy sense that innocent spaces can turn in an instant. That is one reason the site remains so sticky in the public imagination. It is easy to understand, too easy in fact. The stories are simple enough to repeat and disturbing enough to remember. There is a temptation, when telling this kind of story, to race ahead to the hauntings. But the park's own life deserves attention before the ghost stories take over. Lake Shawnee was not always in ruin. There was once a functioning place where people gathered, laughed, ate, swam, and spent time together. The hauntings only feel powerful because they are built in a social world that existed first. That is the deeper tension of the site. It is not just that people died here, it is that people lived here too. Families came here with ordinary hopes. Children wanted rides, adults wanted a day off, young people wanted a place to be seen. The park was woven into local life, which means that its decline was not abstract either. When it began to fail, the loss was felt in memory as much as in economics. An amusement park does not just close, it leaves behind a version of itself that people continue to carry. And at Lake Shawnee, that leftover version became the seed of everything that followed. The rust, the weeds, the silence, the repeated tales of death, the sense that the land had always been holding something back. The park was built for joy, but joy was never the only thing standing there. And that is why, once the ride stopped moving, the place did not become empty. It became available for myths. By the time Lake Shawnee started to acquire its darker reputation, the park's history had already become tangled with stories of tragedy. That is usually how these places work. A death is remembered, then it is repeated, then it is linked to the location, then the location itself begins to absorb the feeling of the death, even if the details are incomplete or disputed. Lake Shawnee is especially complicated because the site is associated with multiple deaths, but the public story rarely treats them all with the same level of certainty. Some are repeated often, some are described in vivid detail, some are referenced only in passing, and some seem to exist more fully in folklore than in surviving records. That does not make the stories less powerful, but it does make them more typical of haunted place mythology, where the line between documented event and retold legend is often blurred by design. The death people remember first is the girl on the swing. It is obviously the kind of story that haunts an audience immediately because the image is so sharp. Child on a ride meant for delight. A truck backing into the wrong place at the wrong time. A moment that should have been ordinary becoming suddenly final. In the versions most commonly repeated, the girl is struck and killed when a delivery vehicle reverses into the swing area. The details are grim, precisely because they are mundane. There is no theatrical villainy, no cinematic catastrophe. It was just a fatal accident in a space built for fun. That is what makes it linger. The swing ride itself becomes a visual shorthand for the park's entire legend. It is movement turned into memory, joy turned into aftermath. Even for listeners who do not care about paranormal claims, the image is hard to shake. A swing is a symbol of childhood, of motion and lift, of the sensation of briefly leaving the ground. When that image is fused with a death story, the contrast lands with unusual force. And because it is the most repeated story, it has also become the one most likely to be framed in supernatural terms. People claim the girl still appears near the ride. They report a sense of presence, of movement, or a childlike figure near the old swing area. Whether or not those claims can be verified is another matter entirely. What matters for the legend is that the story has taken on a life beyond the event itself. The site does not simply contain a death story. It contains a death story that keeps returning. The drowning stories work in a similar way, though each has its own texture. One version is it involves a boy in the swimming pool. In some retellings, as stated earlier, his arm became caught in a drain pipe, making the accident feel both terrifying and helpless. In others, the mechanism is less precise, but the outcome is the same. A child dies in the place designed for summer recreation. The pool, like the swing, becomes a symbol of broken expectation. A park offering family pleasure now carries the image of a life cut short in the middle of play. Another story, tied to the water, is often linked to the lake or pond itself. Again, the details shift across accounts. A canoe tipping, a child going under, panic, a failed rescue. What remains consistent is the sense that water at the park was not merely scenic. It was dangerous in the way any body of water can be dangerous, especially when families are relaxed, children are unsupervised for a moment, and the day feels safe enough to lower everyone's guard. These stories are often summarized quickly in haunted location coverage, but they deserve a little more attention because they show how the park's tragedy was not one single event. It was a pattern of vulnerability. A place meant to contain joy also contained risk. A site meant for children and families became associated with a series of sudden losses that were all more haunting because they happened in a place designed to make people feel protected. Then there are the remaining deaths, the ones that are most often collected into the number 6 without much elaboration. This is where the story becomes murkier. The figure of 6 visitor deaths is repeated frequently enough to sound stable, but the exact roster is not always equally clear in public material. Some retellings imply a fuller record than the surviving evidence comfortably supports. Others seem to compress separate stories into a single count. That ambiguity is common in haunted site history. Once a number becomes part of the legend, people stop asking how it was assembled. But for a podcast script, that uncertainty can actually be useful if handled honestly. It allows you to lean into the discomfort without overstating what can't be cleanly proven. The listener does not need a perfect death certificate for every claim to feel the weight of the site. The broader truth is enough. Lake Shawnee accumulated tragedy, and those tragedies became part of how the park was remembered long after the ride stopped running. That memory is important because it shows the difference between a place where something happened and a place where stories keep happening after the fact. Lake Shawnee is firmly in the second category. The park's deaths did not remain isolated incidents. They became the foundation for a haunted identity that has continued to grow for decades. That identity feeds on contrast. The park was supposed to be safe. The park was supposed to be bright. The park was supposed to be temporary in the best way possible. The kind of place you leave with sugar on your fingertips and a memory in your pocket. Instead, the stories attached to it carry the opposite feeling. They are about interruption, vulnerability, and the collapse of ordinary expectation. A ride, a pool, a lake, a child, a mistake, a death. Those are simple components, but together they create a narrative that feels stubbornly unfinished. And that unfinished quality is where the unease lives. Because the park did not simply produce these stories and then vanish. It held them. It left them behind. And when the property later became abandoned, those stories had room to spread. The most haunting thing about Lake Shawnee may not be the deaths at all. It may be what happened after the laughter stopped. A working amusement park has movement built into its identity. People arrive. People leave. Music carries across the grounds. Rides turn. Water splashes. Cash changes hands. Noise fills the gaps. Even a modest park feels alive because it is designed to be in motion. Abandonment strips all of that away. Lake Shawnee. Once the park closed in 1966, the place did not become instantly eerie. It became slowly stranger. First the ride stopped. Then the paint aged. Then the metal began to surrender to weather. Grass pushed up where people had once walked with purpose. Rust spread across surfaces that had once been cleaned and repainted. The lake remained, but its meaning changed. The pool remained, but its function was gone. The grounds, once arranged for pleasure, became a field of memory and neglect. That gradual decay is often more unsettling than a dramatic collapse. A destroyed place is over. A decaying place is still in process. It looks like it's on its way to becoming one thing, but not quite there yet. That in-between state is part of what gives Lake Shawnee its power. It appears unfinished. Time has not closed the book on it. Time has only left it open. The visual language of ruins does a lot of work here. Broken attractions are unsettling partly because they preserve the shape of happiness after the happiness itself has gone. A swing still hanging in place no longer looks playful if nobody is riding it. A pool without swimmers feels less like a place of recreation and more like a vessel for absence. A Ferris wheel, even in stillness, carries the memory of motion, which makes its silence feel louder. At Lake Shawnee, abandonment did not erase the park's history. It exposed it. It exposed metal, the overgrown ground, the weathered structures. All of it turned the site into a kind of visual proof that something once existed here and no longer does. That is a deeply effective ingredient in haunt story culture because it gives the imagination room to fill in the missing parts. And people always do fill them in. Once a place becomes abandoned, the public begins asking questions about it. Not just what it was, but what might remain. Not just who was here, but who may still be here. The site becomes less like a property and more like a prompt. Every broken ride invites projection. Every empty corner suggests a presence. Every shadow in the weeds becomes a candidate for a story. Lake Shawnee benefited from that transformation in the same way many haunted sites do. The decay made the legend easier to believe. Even people who do not care about ghosts can understand why a rusting amusement park feels wrong in the dark. The environment itself has a narrative tension. It looks as if the place should be loud, but it is quiet. It looks as if something should still be operating, but nothing is. That mismatch creates unease without needing any paranormal claim at all. The site also fits into a larger cultural pattern. Abandoned amusement parks often feel more haunted than other kinds of ruins because they are tied to childhood, family, and seasonal joy. A factory can be eerie, but an amusement park carries emotional associations that make its ruin hit harder. It is not just the loss of a business, it is the visible end of a certain kind of collective memory. For Lake Shawnee, that memory became inseparable from tragedy. The park had already been linked to deaths, and now the physical site itself seemed to confirm that something had gone wrong there. The abandoned grounds gave the older stories a place to settle. That is one reason the site kept drawing attention long after it stopped operating. People were not just looking at the old rides, they were looking at a landscape that looked as though it had absorbed everything told about it. And once the park became abandoned, the haunting reputation intensified in a new way. It was no longer just a matter of local memory or anecdotal stories. The site started to attract investigators, paranormal tourism, photographers, and curious visitors who wanted to feel the atmosphere for themselves. That attention helped preserve the park's identity, but it also changed it. The place became a destination not for entertainment in the old sense, but for a more modern kind of thrill, the thrill of being unsettled on purpose. The shift matters because it shows how abandonment can turn a place into an experience. The decay becomes part of the product, the quiet becomes part of the performance, and the ruin becomes part of the story's authority. Lake Shawnee did not just decay into obscurity, it decayed into legend. And once that happened, it was never likely to become just another forgotten patch of land again. Once Lake Shawnee became abandoned, the story changed shape again. It was no longer just a park that had closed. It was no longer just a site with a troubled past. It became a haunted destination in the full modern sense of the word. A place people visited because they expected a feeling, a story, or a sign. That change happened gradually, but it was unmistakable. The park's decayed rides and overgrown grounds gave it a ready-made atmosphere, and that atmosphere did a great deal of the storytelling for it. A rusted swing set does not need much help to look eerie after sunset. An empty pool does not need much help to feel wrong when no one is there. And a lake, a field, a forgotten track, a collapsing structure, all of it begins to suggest absence in a way that feels almost deliberate. Lake Shawnee became the kind of place that paranormal culture loves because it offers visual evidence before anyone says a word. You can look at the site and immediately understand why someone might believe something strange lives there. That does not prove the hauntings, of course, but it does explain why the story spread so easily. Visitors and investigators have described the usual repertoire of eerie experiences: cold spots, the sensation of being watched, unexplained noises, voices that seem to appear when no one is standing, shadows moving at the edge of sight, a sense that the swing area in particular carries a strange emotional charge. These reports are exactly the sort that keep a haunted site alive in public memory, because they are personal enough to feel convincing and vague enough to resist easy dismissal. What makes Lake Shawnee especially effective as a ghost story setting is that the hauntings are never just about one thing. They are not only about the deaths, they are not only about the land history, They are not only about the abandonment, they are about all of those elements stacked together, each one giving the next more emotional weight. That layering is why the site gets treated as one of the most haunted places in America. Not because every claim can be pinned down with certainty, but because the place has become a perfect vessel for haunted storytelling. The old tragedies give it gravity, the park deaths give it shock value, the abandonment gives it a visual setting, the tourism gives it repetition. Once all of those forces start feeding one another, the legend becomes self-sustaining. There is also a very modern dynamic at work here. A haunted place today is not just feared, it is consumed. People visit it, film it, post it, narrate it, and package it for an audience that wants a controlled encounter with fear. Lake Shawnee fits this pattern very neatly. The park's reputation is now part of its identity in a commercial sense. Ghost tours, paranormal events, and media coverage help keep the site visible, which in turn keeps the stories circulating. That can be unsettling in its own right. A place once built for children and families becomes a stage for curated dread. The same grounds that once hosted recreation now host anticipation. People arrive not to relax, but to be unnerved. The site becomes a kind of performance space where the audience wants to believe they are close to something they cannot explain. And because of that, Lake Shawnee is no longer just being remembered, it is being reenacted. This matters because reenactment changes the emotional life of a place. Once people arrive expecting a haunting, every creak of metal and shift of darkness begins to participate in the story. The site becomes a mirror for expectation. The visitor comes seeking unease and often leaves with exactly that. Whether the source is supernatural, psychological, or simply atmospheric, the result is the same. The site keeps the legend moving. The 6 deaths especially have become part of that loop. They are repeated often enough to create a sense of accumulated loss, but not always with enough clarity to anchor the story in a stable record. That makes them ideal for haunted narrative, because they sit in the space between fact and folklore. They feel real, specific. They feel like the kind of details a legend needs, even when the historical precision is uneven. At this point, the park is more than a ruin and more than a story. It is an active generator of unease. That is why it lasts. Not because it has the biggest rides, not because it had the longest life, and not because it was the most famous amusement park in America. It's because it contains a rare and uncomfortable combination. Old land, older history, public tragedy, private memory, visible decay, and a ghost story infrastructure strong enough to keep the site alive long after its practical purpose ended. Lake Shawnee. It feels haunted because so many different kinds of absence meet there at once. The absence of the old park, the absence of the people who built it, the absence of the children who never grew up in its stories, the absence of the older lives displaced before the park ever existed, the absence of certainty itself. That last one may be the most powerful, because once a place stops offering clear answers, imagination moves in. And imagination, once invited, rarely leaves quietly. Lake Shawnee is frightening in the way that layered places often are, not because one terrible thing happened there, but because so many different forms of human meaning were stacked on top of one another until the ground itself seemed to hold them in place. That is the part of the story that lingers after the ghost stories fade. The park is not only a haunted site, it is a record of how people use land, forget land, rename land, and then later act surprised when the history beneath it still presses upward. At the center of that deeper meaning is a simple discomfort. Lake Shawnee was never just a place for rides. It was a place with earlier significance, later repurposed for leisure, then left to decay once that purpose expired. That pattern, it's unsettling because it reflects something larger than one park. It reflects the way history often works in America, especially when older histories are treated as scenery for newer ambitions. The indigenous history attached to the site should be understood within that larger pattern. It is not a spooky garnish. It is a reminder that the land had meaning before the park, and that later generations inherited a place whose earlier significance they did not create. When a site with that kind of history is turned into entertainment, there is an inevitable moral tension. Even if the builders did not intend harm, the decision still sits inside a broader system of replacement, erasure, and convenience. That tension makes the park's modern haunted identity more serious than a simple ghost tale. The unease does not come only from whether people hear voices or see shadows. It comes from the fact that the place is a layered record of use and misuse, memory and neglect, grief and performance. The rusted rides are not just creepy objects. They are the remains of a promise that did not last. The overgrown grounds are not just picturesque ruins. They are evidence that time does not respect human certainty. The older stories are not just folklore. They are part of the site's moral weight. This is why Lake Shawnee remains so effective as a story. It has enough surface-level haunting material to satisfy anyone looking for a paranormal episode. But it also has enough historical depth to reward a more thoughtful listener. The audience can come for the swing ride and the deaths, then leave with a more complicated feeling about land, memory, and the afterlife of places people try to repurpose without fully understanding them. That complexity is what gives the site staying power. A lot of haunted places rely on one strong legend. Lake Shawnee works because it has several. A frontier story, indigenous history, an amusement park, a series of deaths, abandonment, paranormal tourism. Each layer reinforces the others. Each layer adds a little more pressure. By the time people start speaking of curses, it is almost easy to see why the idea took hold. But a curse, in this case, is not the most useful word. The more accurate word may simply be consequence. People build, people use, people forget, people return later and call the silence haunted. Lake Shawnee is a place where those steps can be felt all at once. That is why it does not need exaggeration to remain compelling. The facts are eerie enough. The setting is eerie enough. The history is eerie enough. And the strangest thing of all is that the park's attraction now depends on the very qualities that once marked its decline. The abandonment that made it obsolete is the same abandonment that made it famous again. The ruin that ended the amusement park became the reason people came back to look at it. The silence that followed the closure became the new soundtrack. That is a full circle kind of haunting. Not theatrical, not tidy, just human. By the time the light falls over Lake Shawnee, the place no longer feels like a park at all. It feels like a memory that has not finished speaking. The rides may be gone. The crowd may be gone. The music may be gone. But the ground remains. And if the stories are right, that is the one thing at Lake Shawnee that never really left. If you found this story compelling, please follow, rate, and share the show. It helps others discover these deep dives into the stranger corners of history. And if you have a family legend of your own, half-truth, half-ghost story, I'd love to hear it. This has been The Eclectic. Stay curious, stay questioning, and as always, stay eclectic.